The Universal Aptitude Assessment had been running for precisely 50,347 years, 2 months, and 16 days. Not that anyone was counting, except for the obsessively detail-oriented Cronarch species, who kept track of such things the way other civilizations collected stamps or argued about sports statistics. The assessment itself was a marvel of bureaucratic efficiency, which is to say, it was simultaneously the most comprehensive and most tedious evaluation system ever devised by sentient life. Administered by the Galactic Competency Commission, the assessment measured everything from basic survival instincts to advanced problem-solving capabilities across 847 known sentient species. The tests had been refined, updated, and bureaucratized to the point where it could accurately predict a species' likelihood of surviving anything from a supernova to a particularly aggressive audit. The testing facility itself was a testament to over-engineering, a space station the size of a small moon equipped with environmental simulators that could recreate the conditions of any known planet, plus a few that existed only in the fevered imaginations of theoretical physicists. The assessment's most tantalizing feature was not its comprehensive scope or its technological sophistication, but rather its complete and utter failure to produce a perfect score. Ever. In 5 millennia of testing across nearly 1,000 different species, the highest recorded score belonged to the crystalline Netherians at a respectable but not quite perfect 97.3%. The Netherians, being silicon-based beings of pure logic and mathematical precision, had approached the assessment with the methodical efficiency of a computer program. They had solved every puzzle, overcome every obstacle, and demonstrated survival techniques that bordered on the miraculous. Yet somehow, they had missed perfection by 2.7 percentage points, a margin that had haunted them for the past 3,000 years. The myth of the perfect score had become something of a galactic legend. Scholars debated whether it was even theoretically possible. Philosophers waxed poetic about the inherent imperfection of existence. Gamblers across the galaxy placed increasingly elaborate bets on which species might eventually break the barrier. The Galactic Competency Commission, meanwhile, had grown so accustomed to imperfection that they had stopped updating their perfect score protocols. The manual sometime around year 37,000. The document now resided in a dusty digital archive, right next to the emergency procedures for what to do if reality breaks, and proper etiquette when meeting your own time-traveling grandmother. Into this atmosphere of resigned imperfection walked Bex Morrison, a human from a planet called Earth that most galactic citizens couldn't locate on a map without consulting 3 different star charts and a good astrologer. Bex was, by all appearances, the most unremarkable candidate the assessment had ever seen. While other species sent their finest specimens, warrior philosophers, genius athletes, or beings of pure intellectual energy, Earth had somehow managed to volunteer someone who looked like they had wandered away from a camping trip and gotten lost in a space station. Bex stood 5 feet and 8 inches tall, possessed the kind of weathered tan that suggested a lifetime spent outdoors, and wore clothes that appeared to have been constructed from materials found in the clearance section of a wilderness outfitter's catalog. Their most notable feature was an expression of mild curiosity, as if they were touring a particularly interesting museum, rather than preparing for the most comprehensive examination in galactic history. When asked about their qualifications, Bex had mentioned something about growing up in the backwoods and learning a thing or two from the old folks, which the translation software had rendered as possessing rudimentary survival knowledge acquired through informal educational methodology. The 3 proctors assigned to Bex's assessment were, in their own ways, representative of the galaxy's finest. Helix, a member of the insectoid Vorthax species, possessed compound eyes that could perceive 17 different spectrums of light simultaneously, and a brain that processed information at roughly the speed of a quantum computer having a particularly good day. Helix had proctored over 3,000 assessments and had never encountered a species that could surprise them, though several had tried, including the memorable incident with the plasma dolphins and their interpretive dance routine. Nim belonged to the aquatic Siphonari, a species that had evolved in the crushing depths of their homeworld's oceans. Nim's species communicated through a complex combination of bioluminescent patterns and subsonic vibrations, which made them excellent at detecting deception and absolutely terrible at small talk. They had a reputation for being able to sense a candidate's emotional state through minute changes in their bioelectric field, a skill that had proven invaluable in detecting the rare candidate who attempted to cheat on the assessment. Crescent was perhaps the most unusual of the three proctors, being a member of the energy-based luminar species. Crescent existed as a controlled field of coherent light and electromagnetic radiation, held together by what could charitably be called willpower and what cynics referred to as cosmic stubbornness. They had been present at the assessment of the legendary Netherians and had personally witnessed the moment when that species had fallen just short of perfection. Crescent had spent the subsequent 3 millennia wondering what combination of factors might finally produce a perfect score. As Bex settled into the pre-assessment preparation chamber, the three proctors exchanged the kind of looks that highly experienced professionals share when they encounter something that doesn't quite fit their established categories. Helix's compound eyes adjusted to focus on Bex's calm demeanor. Nim's bioluminescent patches flickered in a pattern that roughly translated to "this should be interesting." Crescent's energy field pulsed with the electromagnetic equivalent of a bemused chuckle. The assessment chamber itself was beginning its initialization sequence, environmental controls humming to life as the facility's computers began generating the customized survival scenario that would serve as Bex's test. 50,000 years of accumulated knowledge went into creating each unique challenge, and the system had never failed to push even the most capable candidates to their absolute limit. What none of them realized was that they were about to witness something that would fundamentally alter their understanding of survival, ingenuity, and the peculiar way that evolution sometimes worked backward to move forward. The assessment chamber materialized around Bex with the kind of seamless efficiency that only came from 50,000 years of practice and an unlimited budget for showing off. One moment they were standing in a sterile white room surrounded by floating holographic displays, and the next they found themselves in what appeared to be a primordial wilderness that had been designed by someone with a particularly vivid imagination and a concerning enthusiasm for deadly flora and fauna. The environment was a masterpiece of hostile design. The assessment system had crafted a landscape that combined the worst features of 17 different death worlds, seasoned with a few original touches that existed nowhere else in the galaxy. Carnivorous plants with teeth that could bite through titanium swayed in a breeze that carried the scent of sulfur and impending doom. Predators that looked like they had been assembled from the spare parts of nightmares prowled through forests, where the trees themselves occasionally tried to eat unwary travelers. The ground was a patchwork of quicksand, acid pools, and terrain that seemed stable right up until the moment you stepped on it. 50 different environmental hazards had been carefully distributed throughout the testing area, each one calibrated to challenge a different aspect of survival instinct. The assessment's artificial intelligence had spent considerable processing power ensuring that no single approach could overcome all the challenges. Physical strength might handle the predators, but would be useless against the toxic atmosphere zones. Advanced technology could neutralize the environmental hazards, but would be ineffective against the psychic parasites that fed on electrical fields. The system had been designed to be unsolvable through any single methodology, a fact that had been proven by 47,000 years of consistent failure to achieve perfection. Bex stood in the center of this carefully orchestrated chaos, dressed in nothing more than basic clothing that wouldn't have looked out of place at a weekend camping trip. No advanced tools, no energy weapons, no sophisticated scanning equipment. The assessment protocol was quite specific about this. Candidates were allowed only what they could carry in their pockets, and Bex's pockets contained the kind of items that would have made a galactic survivalist weep with despair. A small knife that looked like it had been inherited from someone's great-grandfather, a length of rope that appeared to have been braided by hand, and a collection of what the monitoring systems could only classify as organic debris. The three proctors observed from their monitoring station, their expectations calibrated by decades of experience. Helix had seen species attempt to solve the challenge through brute force, advanced mathematics, psychic manipulation, and one memorable instance involving interpretive dance. The Vorthak's compound eyes were already cataloging the most likely failure points based on Bex's apparent lack of sophisticated equipment. Nim's bioluminescent patterns reflected a mixture of curiosity and mild concern. The human's bioelectric field was remarkably calm for someone who had just been deposited in the middle of a death trap. Crescent's energy field pulsed with the kind of patient attention that came from having witnessed thousands of these assessments. What they expected to see was some variation on the standard survival approaches. Most species began with a period of frantic activity, either attempting to build shelter, construct weapons, or establish some form of technological advantage. The more intellectually advanced candidates typically spent their first few minutes analyzing the environment, categorizing threats, and developing comprehensive strategies. The purely physical species usually started by testing their strength against the nearest predator, while the more cautious ones began by seeking the safest possible location to make their stand. Bex did none of these things. Instead, they began what could only be described as the galaxy's most leisurely nature walk. They strolled through the hostile environment with the relaxed demeanor of someone exploring a particularly interesting botanical garden, occasionally pausing to examine a plant, test the flexibility of a branch, or run their fingers along the surface of a stone. The monitoring systems tracked their movement with increasing confusion as Bex systematically ignored every obvious threat while collecting an assortment of materials that seemed to have been chosen entirely at random. A vine here, plucked from a tree that was actively trying to strangle a nearby boulder. A collection of stones there, selected from the edge of what was clearly a trap, designed to collapse under the weight of anything larger than a particularly ambitious insect. Bex gathered aromatic plants from areas where the very air was toxic, flexible branches from trees that had been specifically engineered to be impossible to break, and seeds from flowers that bloomed only in conditions that should have been instantly fatal to any carbon-based life form. The proctors exchanged glances that conveyed the universal professional confusion of experts watching someone completely ignore their expertise. Helix's compound eyes dilated in patterns that indicated deep bewilderment. Nim's bioluminescent patches flickered in what their species used to express the concept of, "This makes no sense whatsoever." Presence energy field fluctuated in frequencies that roughly translated to, "I have been doing this job for 3,000 years and I have absolutely no idea what this human thinks they're accomplishing." The most remarkable aspect of Bex's behavior was not just what they were collecting, but how they were collecting it. They moved through the environment with a kind of casual awareness that suggested they understood exactly how dangerous everything was, but simply didn't consider the danger to be particularly relevant to their current activities. When a predator that looked like a cross between a saber-toothed tiger and a particularly aggressive thunderstorm approached, Bex simply stepped to one side at precisely the right moment, allowing the creature to charge past them into a conveniently placed acid pool. When the ground beneath their feet began to give way, they were already moving toward more stable terrain, apparently having anticipated the collapse several seconds before it occurred. The organic materials that Bex collected were arranged in a specific pattern that became increasingly complex as they continued their methodical exploration. Vines were tested for tensile strength and flexibility. Branches were examined for their spring properties and breaking points. Stones were evaluated for weight, aerodynamic properties, and the satisfying sound they made when struck against other stones. The aromatic plants were crushed to release their scents, which Bex sampled with the focused attention of a chemist analyzing a particularly interesting compound. What was becoming clear to the monitoring systems, if not yet to the proctors, was that Bex was not randomly collecting materials. They were shopping. Every item they selected had been chosen for specific properties that would contribute to some larger purpose, and that purpose was beginning to take shape as they moved through the environment, with the patient efficiency of someone who had done this sort of thing before. The assessment chamber's artificial intelligence was running increasingly complex analyses, trying to determine what possible strategy could account for Bex's behavior. The system had been programmed to recognize and respond to every known survival methodology, but Bex's approach didn't match any of the established patterns. They weren't building shelter, constructing weapons, or establishing a defensive position. They were creating something else entirely. Something that the galaxy's most sophisticated survival assessment system had never encountered before. As the first hour of the assessment concluded, Bex had collected enough materials to stock a small wilderness outfitter, and they had begun to arrange these materials in configurations that suggested a level of planning that was both comprehensive and completely invisible to galactic understanding. The proctors were beginning to suspect that they were about to witness something unprecedented, though none of them could have imagined just how unprecedented it would turn out to be. Part 3. The Perfect Symphony of Chaos. The transformation began so subtly that the monitoring systems nearly missed it. Bex had spent the better part of 2 hours arranging their collected materials in what appeared to be a random pattern across the landscape. But as the third hour commenced, the true genius of their methodology became apparent. What had looked like the scattered debris of an enthusiastic but disorganized nature walk was actually a carefully orchestrated network of interconnected mechanisms, each one designed to trigger the next in a cascade of precisely calculated consequences. The first trap was almost insultingly simple: a bent branch, held in tension by a vine that had been positioned exactly where one of the assessment's more aggressive predators would step during its routine patrol. The creature in question, a beast that resembled what might happen if a rhinoceros decided to cosplay as a particularly angry thundercloud, had been stalking Bex for the past hour with the patient determination of a predator that had never encountered prey it couldn't eventually catch. When it finally committed to its charge, stepping directly onto the trigger mechanism, the branch snapped forward with enough force to send the creature tumbling into a carefully prepared pit that hadn't been there an hour earlier. The pit, as it turned out, was the second trap. Bex had somehow convinced a collection of the environment's carnivorous plants to relocate themselves into a formation that would catch anything falling from above. The plants, being somewhat limited in their cognitive abilities, had apparently failed to consider that their new arrangement might result in them becoming participants in something considerably more complex than their usual diet of unwary insects and the occasional small mammal. The rhinoceros thundercloud hybrid's impact triggered the third trap, which was where things began to get interesting. The creature's thrashing disturbed a carefully balanced collection of stones that had been arranged to fall in a specific sequence. Each stone had been positioned to strike the next with precisely enough force to continue the chain reaction, while altering its trajectory by a few degrees. The result was a geological percussion section that would have made a composer weep with envy. If composers typically work with materials that could punch holes through reinforced steel, the cascading stones struck a series of vine and branch mechanisms that Bex had distributed throughout the environment, each one calibrated to respond to a specific amount of force applied at a particular angle. The monitoring systems watched in fascination as the network of primitive machines began to activate in sequence, creating a domino effect that spread across the entire testing area with the inexorable momentum of a natural disaster that had been trained in engineering. The fourth trap caught the acid-spitting serpents that had been lurking in the toxic pools, using their own acidic secretions to dissolve the supports of a carefully constructed log bridge. The bridge's collapse created a temporary dam that redirected the flow of one of the environment's more corrosive streams, which in turn flooded a series of tunnels that had been excavated by the area's population of burrowing predators. The flooded tunnels forced the burrowing predators to surface, where they immediately encountered the fifth trap, a collection of aromatic plants that Bex had arranged to release their scents in a pattern that drove the creatures into a frenzy of territorial aggression. The proctors observed this unfolding symphony of controlled chaos with expressions that conveyed the deep existential confusion of beings who had spent their entire careers believing they understood the fundamental principles of survival strategy. Halix's compound eyes were tracking 17 different chain reactions simultaneously, each one following a logical progression that somehow contributed to an overall pattern that defied all known tactical doctrine. Nim's bioluminescent patches had shifted to colors that didn't exist in their species' normal emotional spectrum, indicating a state of bewilderment so profound that it required new forms of biological expression. Crescent's energy field was fluctuating in patterns that suggested they were reconsidering several fundamental assumptions about the nature of intelligence itself. The 6th through 15th traps operated on increasingly sophisticated principles that demonstrated a level of understanding about animal behavior, environmental physics, and cause and effect relationships that would have impressed the galaxy's most advanced ecological engineers. Bex had somehow convinced the environment's various predators to participate in their own capture by exploiting behavioral patterns that were so fundamental to each species that they couldn't be consciously overridden. The result was a series of encounters, where creatures that had been specifically designed to be apex predators found themselves outsmarted by arrangements of sticks, stones, and plant matter that looked like they had been assembled by someone's particularly creative grandmother. The true masterpiece, however, was how each individual trap contributed to the activation of the next set of mechanisms. The falling stones from Trap 3 had not only triggered the vine and branch network, but had also created specific acoustic frequencies that attracted certain species of aerial predators. These creatures, diving toward what they assumed would be an easy meal, instead found themselves entangled in nets woven from the flexible vines that Bex had spent so much time testing for tensile strength. The nets, being designed with a thorough understanding of aerodynamics, didn't simply catch the aerial predators. They redirected their momentum to trigger the next phase of the cascade. While this intricate symphony of mechanical mayhem unfolded around them, Bex provided commentary to the monitoring systems with the casual tone of someone narrating a nature documentary. They explained the behavioral patterns they had observed in each species, described the physical properties of the materials they had selected, and outlined the basic principles of leverage, momentum, and environmental psychology that governed each trap's operation. Their explanations were delivered in the same conversational style someone might use to describe their weekend gardening activities, which somehow made the systematic dismantling of a supposedly impossible survival scenario even more surreal. The assessment chamber's artificial intelligence was running diagnostic routines on itself, trying to determine if its sensors were malfunctioning. The system had been programmed to present challenges that would push any conceivable survival strategy to its absolute limits. But Bex's approach had rendered most of those challenges irrelevant by turning them into components of a larger mechanism. Instead of fighting the environment, they had convinced it to fight itself, and they had done so using tools that were so primitive they predated the invention of the wheel by several geological epochs. The cascade reached its crescendo when the 23rd trap activated a mechanism that had been constructed from materials so basic that the monitoring systems had initially catalogued them as decorative elements. A collection of precisely arranged stones created a fulcrum that launched a carefully selected branch with enough force to trigger the collapse of a formation that the environment's designers had assumed would be geologically stable for the duration of any reasonable assessment. The collapse created a controlled avalanche that simultaneously eliminated the remaining environmental hazards, while herding the few surviving predators into a natural amphitheater, where they could be observed but not interfere with the final phase of Bex's plan. The final trap was a work of art that demonstrated such an understanding of predator psychology that it would have earned a doctorate in xenobiology from any galactic university. The apex predator of the entire simulation, a creature that had been specifically designed to be undefeatable and had maintained that status through 10,000 previous assessments, found itself drawn into a scenario that appealed to every instinct it possessed, while simultaneously rendering every one of its considerable abilities useless. The creature that had been the ultimate test of survival skill became the ultimate demonstration of how survival skill could be redefined by someone who understood that the most sophisticated trap was often the one that convinced its target to trap itself. As the dust settled and the last of the mechanical symphony fell silent, the assessment chamber contained one human sitting peacefully in the center of what had once been a comprehensive survival challenge and was now a carefully organized collection of neutralized threats. Bex looked around at the results of their work with the satisfied expression of someone who had successfully completed a moderately challenging crossword puzzle, completely unaware that they had just accomplished something that would fundamentally alter the galaxy's understanding of intelligence, ingenuity, and the peculiar effectiveness of really good planning combined with really old knowledge. The assessment chamber's artificial intelligence spent 17 minutes and 38 seconds processing the results before announcing its findings. This was approximately 17 minutes and 37 seconds longer than the system had ever needed to calculate a score, and the delay was beginning to make the proctors wonder if they had accidentally witnessed something that had broken the fundamental laws of standardized testing. When the announcement finally came, it was delivered in the flat, emotionless tone that artificial intelligences used when they were reporting information that they found personally offensive to their programming. Assessment complete. Candidate Morrison, Dex. Score 100%. Perfect completion of all survival parameters. No casualties. No environmental damage. All threats neutralized through non-violent intervention. The AI paused, as if struggling with the implications of its own announcement. This outcome was not anticipated by any existing protocol. The galactic reaction was immediate and spectacular. News of the perfect score spread through the galactic communication network with the speed of a particularly juicy scandal involving celebrities and tax evasion. Within hours, bureaucrats who hadn't left their offices in decades were demanding emergency sessions. Scientists who had spent their careers studying the theoretical impossibility of perfect scores were requesting immediate access to the assessment recordings. The crystalline Netherians, who had held the previous high score for 3,000 years, issued a formal statement that basically amounted to, "We demand a recount, and also, how dare you?" The Galactic Competency Commission found itself in the unprecedented position of having to explain how their supposedly foolproof assessment system had been defeated by someone using tools that wouldn't have looked out of place in a museum exhibit about primitive technology. Emergency committees were formed to investigate the possibility of systematic testing errors. Advanced computer systems were deployed to analyze every frame of the assessment recordings, looking for signs of technological assistance or hidden advantages that might explain the impossible results. Meanwhile, Beck sat in the post-assessment debriefing chamber, apparently unaware that they had just triggered the largest administrative crisis in galactic history. When asked to explain their methodology, they responded with the kind of casual humility that made hardened military strategists weep with frustration. "Oh, that's just basic stuff I learned from my grandparents when I was growing up. Nothing special, really, just paying attention to how animals behave and using what's available. My grandfather always said the best trap is the one that makes the target think it's doing what it wants to do anyway." The proctors, who had collectively witnessed over 15,000 assessments, exchanged looks that conveyed the profound existential crisis of professionals who had just discovered that their entire field of expertise had been operating under fundamentally incorrect assumptions. Helix managed to formulate a question that roughly translated to, "But surely you must have studied advanced survival techniques, xenobiology, environmental engineering, or at least basic physics?" Bex's response was a shrug that somehow contained the entire history of human civilization's relationship with making do with whatever happened to be lying around. "Not really," Beck said, with the tone of someone discussing their weekend gardening routine. "I mean, you learn things growing up in the backwoods, how to read animal tracks, what plants are useful for what purposes, how to build things that work with materials you can find anywhere. My grandmother could set snares that would catch anything that walked on four legs, and my grandfather knew how to make tools out of rocks and sticks that would last longer than most of the fancy equipment people buy nowadays. It's just common sense." "Really? You work with what you have and pay attention to what works." The interview continued for several more hours, during which it became increasingly clear that Beggs had accomplished something that had eluded the galaxy's most advanced civilizations by applying knowledge that was considered elementary by human standards. They had solved an assessment designed to test the limits of survival capability, using techniques that were taught to children as basic life skills. The sophistication had been in the simplicity, the advanced nature had been in the primitive approach, and the unprecedented achievement had been accomplished by someone who genuinely believed that what they had done was unremarkable. The final irony was not lost on the galaxy's philosophers and social scientists, who spent the following years writing extensively about the implications of the Morrison assessment. While most species had evolved beyond their primitive survival instincts, developing technology and methodology that replaced the need for such basic skills, humans had apparently refined and perfected those instincts to a level that exceeded anything that advanced technology could achieve. The most sophisticated survival strategy in the galaxy, it turned out, was the one that looked the most primitive to everyone else. The Universal Aptitude Assessment was quietly retired shortly afterward, replaced by a system that acknowledged that intelligence might occasionally manifest in ways that couldn't be measured by conventional standards. The old assessment facility was converted into a museum where visitors could observe recordings of the day when someone proved that the most advanced solution to any problem might be the one that looked like it had been developed by someone's resourceful ancestors who had never heard of the problem in the first place.